Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this event hosted by The Conversation and the International Inequalities Institute at London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Sarah Reid, and I'm The Conversation's Senior Business and Economy Editor. For those of you who might not be familiar with The Conversation, we're the world's largest publisher of original research-based articles, and we work with academics to make their research accessible to a wider audience in the form of impartial and engaging journalism, both online articles and podcasts. So please do have a look at our site if you get the chance. I'm also delighted to welcome our panel of experts this afternoon. Helen Miller, Professor Mike Savage, Emma Chamberlain, and Dr. Maha Rafi Atal. I'll introduce the panel individually now. Helen Miller is Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the leading UK think tank. The IFS pre-budget analyses are always a key guide to the Chancellor's thinking. Helen has almost 2 decades of experience analysing UK fiscal policy and providing trusted advice to policymakers. Her work has been published in leading peer-reviewed journals and media outlets, and she has served as a trustee to the Royal Economic Society. Mike Savage is Professorial Research Fellow at LSE's International Inequalities Institute, where he leads the Wealth, Elites and Tax Justice Research Programme. Before this, he was the Martin White Professor of Sociology at LSE, and between 2015 and 2020, he was Director of LSE's International Inequalities Institute. Emma Chamberlain is a barrister who specialises in tax and trust advice for high net worth private clients. She was co-author of the final report on wealth tax produced by the Wealth Tax Commission and is a visiting Professor of Law at LSE and Oxford University. Emma teaches the Taxation of Global Wealth course at Oxford and is author of the 5th edition of Chamberlain and Whitehouse Trust Taxation and Private Client Planning. Maha Rafi Atal is an academic working at the intersection of business and international affairs, focusing on how multinational corporations acquire political power, how they exercise it, and how they can be held accountable. Maha is the Adam Smith Senior Lecturer in Political Economy in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow. She's also an award-winning business journalist and co-founder and executive director of Public Business, a non-profit supporting research and discussion about the wider impact of business actions. This event this afternoon is being recorded and hopefully it'll be made available on YouTube, subject to us having no technical difficulties. And later on in this session, there'll be time for audience members to put your questions to the panel. You can submit brief questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and please do include your name and affiliation with your question. But for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Helen Miller to start us off this afternoon.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, and hello to all of you tuning in. So for this afternoon, I've been asked to give some high-level background as to why the upcoming budget is going to be a tough one to kind of set the scene for the subsequent discussion about specific tax rises. So I thought I'd show you a few pictures about what's happening in the background. And one key fact I'm going to show you on the first picture, if I can have my first slide, please, is that economic growth really has been dismal. And that really matters. It makes everything harder. It is harder for the public finances for a few reasons, but to give you one simple reason, we have a large stock of debt. That debt would be easier to manage if it was getting smaller relative to the size of the economy. If the economy is not growing, that debt pile just sort of hangs around. It's a problem for that. But it's a problem for many other reasons too, such as living standards. And I won't dwell on this very long, but given the broad topic of tonight, I thought I'd say that I think there's a tendency to think that growth is bad for inequality. And therefore, if you care about inequality, you don't care about growth. I think that's a mistake. And I think, of course, some forms of growth come with rises in inequality, but actually a lack of growth can be directly bad for some forms of inequality. So to give you a few examples, if you don't have income growth, you can have wealth becoming more important relative to income. We've seen that. It's also bad for social mobility. So in a stagnant economy, if my children do well at the expense of somebody else's children, it's a zero-sum game. Whereas if the economy is growing, we can all do well together in a sense. So growth really is important. I think it's one of the key challenges we face. But back to public finances. This is the backdrop, the growth backdrop. If I show you the next picture on my next slide, one of the things that we're expecting to happen in the budget is that the Office for Budget Responsibility, so the official fiscal watchdog, will downgrade productivity. So this chart is what we are calling the kind of productivity hedgehog. What it's showing you in the black line is what has happened to actual productivity. So think of it as the amount the economy produces for a given level of inputs. And the grey lines are showing you successive OBR forecasts. What you can see is that those forecasts have, for a very long time, been over-optimistic. The economy has not panned out in the way that the OBR forecast over many years. The green line is the most recent forecast. As I say, everyone now expects the OBR will downgrade its forecast, and the blue line here is just an illustration of what that might look like. Worth saying, we don't yet know what it will look like until we actually see the real numbers. Now, I suspect you'll hear the Chancellor saying that that's not her fault. And in some sense, she's right, that there's long been this weakness in productivity, and the revision downwards is a reflection that the OBR is now revising expectations of the future. That's not all about what the Chancellor has done. But as you can see in this chart, it's not a shock that the OBR is downgrading its expectations. We have long known, everyone has long known, that the OBR has been more optimistic than other forecasters and than history has turned out. And if we think about why is it going to be a tough budget, it's not just because of this downgrade, it's also because of a choice that Rachel Reeves made last year, and I'll show you this on the next slide, to give herself a really tiny headroom against her main fiscal rule. If I can have the next slide, please. What the next slide is going to show you is the so-called headroom, the buffer against fiscal rules. Now, the binding fiscal rules changes across years here. At the moment, the binding rule is what's called the stability rule, which means the Chancellor wants to balance the current budget in 2029-30. That means make sure revenues are covering day-to-day spending and that borrowing is only happening for investment. The little red bars at the end show you that she has a tiny headroom against that rule. Jeremy Hunt was the first Chancellor to sort of set the trend towards small headrooms. Going back further, the green bars show you that higher headroom was more normal. And in a sense, if you're going to operate the public finances with such a small headroom, you should kind of expect to be blown off course. You won't always know exactly what's going to happen in the economy, but it's completely within the realms of possibility that something will happen, like an OBR downgrade or something else that means you're no longer meeting your rules. It's also worth saying that although this productivity change has got a lot of attention, it is far from the only thing that is changing for Rachel Reeves. So other notable things include the government itself has reversed some of its planned cuts to disability. So the plans it had previously said we're going to cut disability payments. They're not going to do that now. So they're going to have to have some other cuts or find some other money to cover that. And interest rates are higher than they were in the previous forecast. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that although we don't know the exact numbers yet, the Chancellor has almost certainly been handed a set of forecasts showing that without action, she would breach her rule. In the face of that, the question is, what's the Chancellor to do? I don't think she'll breach her fiscal rules. I'm very happy to talk more about why that is. Partly it's just because she has been so clear so frequently that those rules are ironclad and that she's not going to breach them. It's also a bad time for the government to be borrowing in general. It's an expensive time for the government to be borrowing. If debt interest was a government department, it would be the second biggest department outside of the health department. We spend well over 100 billion now servicing the national debt. So I don't think we'll see the Chancellor break her fiscal rules. That means we'll see a fiscal consolidation, so some combination of either cutting back spending or increasing taxes. Again, on spending cuts, they would be possible, but difficult for this government at this moment in time. That's partly because, as I already alluded to, the government tried to cut welfare spending and couldn't get it past the backbench MPs. And on day-to-day spending, on kind of government department spending, the government only settled the so-called spending review back in the summer. So they had the big rows across government about how they're going to spend money on the NHS and justice and transport and so on. Those were all settled for the next 3 years. So she could reopen that, relitigate it and cut back, but that would be difficult. And that's why, given that you'll have this reduction in the forecast, you're not going to break your rules, you can't really move spending, that's why we're seeing all the speculation about tax rises. Again, we don't know the number yet, but it's possible that we'll see tax rises running into the multiple tens of billions. I'll say briefly on the tax rises, there isn't a single right answer to which taxes the Chancellor should raise. Ultimately, we shouldn't forget it is a political choice over who to tax more. And there are very many options. I mean, there really are very, very many ways to raise taxes. But not all tax rises are born equal. Some are much more damaging to economic growth. And importantly, many are more damaging to economic growth than they need to be as a result of poor tax design. So with better tax design, our taxes could do less damage to economic growth. If I can have the next slide, I won't say anything here in detail because I know that other speakers will say more and we'll have this in the Q&A, but just briefly, given the topic of tonight, I thought worth highlighting that there are actually lots of ways in which we already tax wealth. They can be taxes on stocks of wealth, flows of wealth, transactions that involve wealth or transfers. And if you look at all these taxes in the round, it's a part of the system I think that's in particularly desperate need of reform. Again, we'll no doubt talk about this in more detail, but just to flash a few key issues. Most wealth in the UK is held in the form of pensions or housing. Look at how we tax housing. In principle, the taxation of property could be a pretty kind of pro-growth thing to do, or at least like a less bad for growth because property usually can't be moved. But council tax is embarrassingly out of date. We still levy taxes based on 1991 values. It is unjustifiably regressive. And we have stamp duty, a transactions tax on property, which is truly awful. It penalises mobility. In my mind, it shouldn't be part of a modern tax system. So there are things we could do there, but we should first really be trying to fix the structure of our property tax system. On pensions, again, it's a big comprehensive system there, but very broadly, when you hear debates about pensions, it's often about the income tax treatment. Actually, the income tax treatment is the bit that makes sense. We don't tax contributions up front. We do tax pensions we have income tax on pensions when you take them. It makes sense to have tax at one end and not both. What is an anomaly is there's no national insurance for many contributions applied either on the way in or on the way out. So there's more we could do there, but it needs to be sensibly designed. Capital gains tax, capital income taxes, both poorly designed taxes, particularly bad for economic growth, but they don't need to be. So again, big difference here between increasing rates of current taxes, which will come with major downsides, versus reforming the tax to sort of take away some of the worst effects of them, some of the disincentives. Then you could raise more money and raise it in better ways. Inheritance tax, people differ on whether you should have one or not. If you do have one, I think it needs to apply broadly, and we still have a tax that doesn't apply broadly. And I'll say briefly in passing, I get asked all the time, do we need a new wealth tax? I'll give you the spoiler, which is my view is that no, we first need to work out, and we know how to, we first need to implement reforms we know would be better to our current taxes, fix the current taxes first, before you think about having a new tax. Happy to say more about that. Let me leave with one final pitch before I wrap up. So I have my final slide, please. Whatever Rachel Reeves does, there are really good reasons to think that she should take tax reform seriously. If not to try to drive up growth, at least to minimise the damage on growth. It also needs to be a package of measures that are credible in the sense that investors believe that the policies will be followed through and they will bring in the money that the government expects. If we have a package of measures that make investors worry that they'll have to borrow more in future, that's the kind of thing that drives up borrowing costs. And what this chart is showing you is that borrowing costs have jumped up hugely. This is the debt interest bill as a share of national income. It's already something like £65 billion higher in 2025 than it was in 2022. So the total bill's over 100 billion. Small movements in interest rates have a big effect for the public finances. So we'll get into the detail, but it's important that the Chancellor delivers a budget that is not, maybe not pro-growth, but not too damaging on growth and that is credible. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen. That was really interesting. So helpful to see the backdrop to this budget in terms of UK economic growth and the limited fiscal headroom that Rachel Reeves has. And it just really illustrates very well the complex picture that she's trying to produce a budget out of. Thanks very much for that. Time now to hand over to Mike Savage.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. So I'm here to kind of make the case about why we need to tax wealth. And I'm doing that as a sociologist, and a sociologist who's interested in kind of the long range of history. So I'm going to be focused less on the current situation and more on the general patterns about why we should be thinking about taxing wealth. But I also want to say, because sometimes I think the idea that you taxing wealth is somehow seen to be some sort of, crazy left-wing idea. I actually would want to argue that, in fact, taxing wealth is a fairly mainstream, middle ground, left middle, left centre position. And I want to try and set out that argument in kind of 5 steps. So bear with me while I go through these 5 steps. The first thing, again, if you look at the historical record, if you look at societies over many centuries and across the world, taxing wealth is a pretty normal thing to do. In fact, until the recent period, until we've had economic growth in the last 100 years, wealth is the main thing you can tax. That's the reason why William the Conqueror did the Doomsday Book, to find out what assets there were which he could tax. And it's the way in which land has typically been a major source of tax revenue over many centuries. I think we got slightly locked into this idea now that taxing wealth is somehow inappropriate. But really, that is, I think, very largely driven by a kind of wealth defense industry, which is saying, oh, you must treat private wealth as just belonging to the individual that has that wealth. There's a long-standing and liberal mainstream critique saying that the accumulation of wealth is due to social processes. It's to do with the efforts of many, many people, workers, people who build a public infrastructure and all that. And we should recognize, and it's absolutely reasonable for some of that wealth to be shared out. That's my first point. Taxing wealth is not historically aberrant. Second point, we are living in the last 4 or 5 decades in a period of massive booming of wealth assets, and the stats are really quite amazing. So I have just turned to the work of the World Inequality Database, this famous group of economists who work with Thomas Piketty, and they have these estimates that in the UK, until the 1950s, the average adult had £50,000 of wealth. It's now gone up to about £170,000 of wealth per head. That's a massive, multiplying of wealth. So really, and I don't think we come to terms with this, just how much wealth, how much money there is knocking around society. It's not controlled by public purse as much as it used to be, but there is a lot of private wealth in certain hands. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say some of that wealth should be used for the public benefit. But then we come to the issue, so a second trend. The first trend is really the rise of wealth assets, which have gone up spectacularly. We're also, I think, seeing the end of a period between about 1970 and 2000 when wealth was quite remarkably democratized. If we can think back to the kind of Margaret Thatcher revolution of the 1980s, that not just that, it began before and it carried on afterwards. If you look back to the 1950s, the vast majority of wealth was held by the top 10% of wealth holders. So that the stats are normally something like 90% of the total wealth in the country was held by the top 10%. Very, very, very unequal. Margaret Thatcher and the regimes around that have seen a significant broadening of wealth holders, particularly things like selling off council houses, selling off nationalised industries, the encouragement of popular capitalism. And that did see a really important cultural shift in society in which having a certain amount of wealth became something which pretty much everyone wanted to do. Go back 100 years, most people didn't think it was possible to have any wealth. You just had to get by on your income. It has now become much more kind of socially accepted and socially legitimated that everyone should have a degree of wealth, and that has made the appeal of private wealth much more marked than it used to be the case. However, this is kind of my key caveat. That process of democratizing wealth has, I think, reached its limits. So if you look at the stats, in the last 25 years, the share of wealth which is taken by the top 10% is actually, if anything, edging up. And it's still the case, even though it's much more equal than it used to be, that the top 10% of wealth holders take, 55, 58, 60% of wealth. So wealth is still massively more unequal than income is. And there is no trend, as far as I can see, for that to be broadening out in recent times. If anything, it's become more entrenched. Why does that matter? It matters for many reasons. Basically, because it's the more we have, the more we rely upon private assets, the more private assets there are in society, that can lead to festering inequalities. I think we're now living in a period where these festering inequalities around wealth are becoming more and more evident. Give you a couple of examples of that. I've been working with a group of researchers looking at racialized wealth divides. So the divisions between particularly white British households and various kinds of ethnic minority households. And if you look at the Wealth and Assets Survey, which was our major survey looking at wealth inequality, some of the ratios are really quite striking. The Runnymede Trust produced a report in 2020 showing that for every £10 of wealth assets owned by a white British household, Bangladeshi and Black African households had £1. We've been doing some work exploring that using more recent data, and it is still, there's no evidence that's changing. And furthermore, very interesting evidence from the United States produced by economists on shifts in the racial wealth divide suggests that in a period of rising asset prices, then you might expect racialized wealth inequality to actually increase, because the households which had wealth 50 years ago are more likely to have benefited from asset prices inflation since then, and they tend to be white households. So these are big gaps. Gender wealth divide is also big. More difficult to measure because much of that divide is within households, so more difficult to explore using survey stats, but you get some evidence of this when you get things like marital breakups. And people often talk around 30%. Men have around 30% more wealth than women. Much of that is to do with pensions, because men are more likely to have workplace pensions. And then for the tax benefits you get from pensions are more likely to benefit men rather than women. So, but the third key way in which wealth inequalities are festering is around age. And here I'm sure all the viewers on this program will recognize that much of the wealth is pooling in elderly households, younger households, much less likely to have wealth. But we're also seeing the kind of what I call a time wealth bomb. We are going to experience in the coming decades massive transfer of the wealth of older people as they die towards younger people, and that's massively going to tilt the social relations in our society, so that younger generations, if you haven't got significant resources coming in from your wealthy parents, you are going to find it more difficult to compete in all sorts of ways. So that's the fifth. That really is my kind of fifth point. The wealth inequalities are festering, and we need to tackle them if we care about issues like meritocracy, a fair deal, people recognizing we all have a kind of levelish playing field. And you can argue that, I think, without coming over as some kind of strident radical. It's a fairly middle ground position. Quickly, in my last minute, I just want to. So Helen made these really interesting comments about, do we need a wealth tax versus reforming various kinds of taxation on income flows from wealth. To be honest, I'm fairly open-minded on this. Having said that, for me, the attraction of a wealth tax idea is I think it's easy to defend in terms of a narrative. To me, not being an economist, I find one of the difficulties with Rachel Reeves and the Labour government is the narrative isn't really clear. What kind of society are we trying to achieve? A wealth tax would be a way of crisply emphasising it is fair and reasonable for wealthy people to be taxed a small amount on what you might see as excessive wealth. I think there's a narrative around that, which is easier than saying we're going to tax, say, capital gains, but not inheritance. That looks a much more ad hoc. And my own view of this government is we need a message about what are you trying to achieve, and a wealth taxation message around questions of fairness would, I think, be understood by a significant number of voters. And if you look at many of the opinion polls, many voters would be very enthusiastic about a wealth tax. So I really want to keep the debate about the wealth tax open, even though I'm not expecting Rachel Reeves to be announcing one next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Really interesting historical trajectory there of wealth in the UK, and interesting thoughts too on a wealth tax, and whether that's something we might see next week from the Chancellor. I'd like to hand over now to Emma Chamberlain.
Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm going to talk a little bit about how, if we chose to do so, we might be able to get more revenue from the wealthy and perhaps not deter growth. But we have to be perhaps rather cleverer and long-term about how we do this. And I guess that's what I'm going to talk about now. A bit of background, I think, and it's helpful to look at this in a sort of wider international context. I think there's no doubt that the way we tax earnings and income generally, is much easier to design than taxes on the stock of wealth and the transfers of wealth. I think it's a general sort of international consensus that income should be taxed, and people mainly differ on the rate and thresholds and possible exemptions. But as Mike's demonstrated, there's really no consensus either in the UK or internationally, or on how, even whether to tax wealth. Inheritance and wealth taxes do seem to raise much more cultural and moral issues as much as revenue issues, and I think that makes it much more difficult to get consensus. For example, should we be taxing earnings more than inherited wealth? Because generally we do at the moment. Earners pay more in tax on per pound than someone who inherits wealth. Is that right? Or is it immoral or economically wrong to tax any wealth because somehow it penalises savers, particularly if the stock of wealth may already have suffered tax? And people get particularly worked up about the idea that their home should be taxed because they don't view it as a financial asset, although obviously it is a financial asset. They don't want to pay inheritance tax if it gets handed on to the children. So one of the problems we have on wealth taxes is that everyone is happy with a wealth tax as long as the asset they own isn't going to be subject to it. Now, in 2020, we recommended on the Wealth Tax Commission that if you did want to raise taxes to pay for COVID, you could consider a one-off wealth tax. We didn't actually recommend an annual wealth tax. We moved away from that for a variety of reasons that you can read about then. As much to do with administrative complexity, valuation, and liquidity, issues that shouldn't be underestimated. They are practical design issues that in the end we could not easily work out how to solve within our existing system. But even a one-off wealth tax never got off the ground for a number of reasons. First, because we were insistent that it had to cover pensions, homes, and all business assets. And as I've said, people with a home didn't see it as a financial asset. People with final salary pensions didn't believe these had any true taxable value. We upset basically everyone. So I think that was the second mistake, although I still think it's absolutely necessary if you are going to have capital taxes and wealth taxes, that they have to apply to everything. Because as soon as you introduce an exemption, you draw a line in the sand and you encourage avoidance. And that's one very difficult thing about capital taxes. I think another mistake was probably calling it a wealth tax. Maybe it should have been called a COVID recovery tax because that's set everybody off. And I think the final reason why nobody really took up the idea of a one-off wealth tax was that borrowing was very cheap. So a lot of Labour MPs said to us, we don't really need to do it. You can just borrow more cheaply. Well, that has now gone out of the window. But I think the work we did on wealth taxes wasn't lost, wasn't a waste of time, because it illustrated wider problems with capital taxes and design generally. And as I've said, there is no international political consensus on the best model. Some countries such as Austria, New Zealand, Australia, Sweden, Canada, which are generally regarded as quite progressive economies, have no inheritance tax on death or indeed on lifetime gifts. Why is that? Well, it wasn't really a cultural issue there. It was a practical issue. The taxes they had on death, inheritance taxes, the wealth taxes became completely dysfunctional for a very practical reason, which is that the wealthy are very good at lobbying and they introduced lots of exemptions. And then in the end, the only people paying it were not the wealthy or not the most wealthy. So they became deeply unpopular. Switzerland probably does have quite a successful wealth tax. It doesn't have inheritance tax or capital gains tax, but it does have a wealth tax which starts at very low thresholds, very broad base, and very low rates. And for my money, if you're going to reform capital taxes generally, that would be the way to go. But I think we can't underestimate the importance of a lack of consensus, both internationally and domestically, in determining the policy towards the taxation of wealth. Labour raised less when they introduced capital transfer tax in 1975 than estate duty, despite having very high rates, simply because everyone waited till the Conservatives got back in and they knew that they would reverse the policy, which duly happened in 1986. And since then, successive UK governments have more or less left inheritance tax alone. Even the recent changes to farms and businesses are not fundamentally changing the structure of our capital taxes. So as Helen says, it's completely dysfunctional, really. We allow people to make lifetime gifts of cash and businesses, largely free of inheritance tax, provided you survive 7 years. I don't know why 7 rather than 10 or 20. If you don't survive 7 years, you pay tax on death, subject to some limited reliefs. And we raise more actually in inheritance tax than in most other countries, apart, I think, from France. For various reasons, we make it very hard to give away your home during your lifetime, but if you want to do it on death, we give you an extra relief. So there's no real logic or policy to any of this. So what about the current budget? I think certainly the endless pitch rolling, particularly directed towards wealthy people, is really unhelpful and actually deters people coming to the UK because it lacks certainty and stability. So I would say, first of all, if we're going to have wealth taxes, and I think there is a case for them, there needs to be a long-term plan that everyone can see fits together so we avoid endless budget speculation each year, which does make the UK very unattractive for people coming. Secondly, if you want to reform capital taxes, I've come to the conclusion you may need to abandon inheritance tax and start again with something like a tax on the donee rather than the estate. So instead of the deceased estate bearing all the tax at a flat rate, the tax is paid by those who inherit, and the more they inherit, the more tax they pay. And I think thirdly, you do need some political consensus. And as a society, we need to decide what we want to achieve. Do we want special reliefs for businesses and farms and homes? And if so, why? And is that fair? Fourth, and perhaps quite fundamentally, I think we risk making capital taxes far too complicated and trying to do too many things. Let's not forget that the very wealthy, those with perhaps more than 10, 20 million, can leave fairly easily. They can just reduce the number of days in the UK. And then you are into sort of new ways of stopping them leaving, all of which is quite counterproductive. I do think the idea of an annual wealth tax, at least at the moment, is dead. It's a non-starter in our current system and would take quite a long time to set up. Even a one-off wealth tax now, I think, can only be justified if you had a political mandate to do it in an election. We've got nothing like COVID, which is an exceptional circumstance. And although you could have it as a political mandate in a political manifesto, and you could do some anti-avoidance provisions to stop even those who've left from avoiding the tax, I think it would be still quite a difficult political sell. So in some ways, looking at it just at the immediate time, I think a wealth tax is a diversion. We should work at improving our existing capital taxes, including council tax, stamp duty, capital gains tax, as well as inheritance tax. And then that leads me to saying it's much easier to improve and reform them politically if you lower the rates and you broaden the base, because losers will then shout less hard. And remember, losers always shout much harder than winners. So on capital taxes, I would generally favour no reliefs, low taxes, broad base, less complexity, a much more rough and ready way of proceeding. And finally, what to do in this budget if you do want to have some form of wealth tax. One option is just to introduce a very simple lump sum tax system of quite a high annual amount, which might go up in bands for the wealthy. You don't worry too much about valuations. So, for example, you could say that for those with wealth of between 5 and 10 million, which would have to be defined to include wealth and family trusts, not just wealth you own individually, you pay a flat fee of, say, 20,000 every year, going up in bands thereafter to avoid planning and to avoid problems on valuation. What you want to ensure with capital taxes is minimal exemptions, very simple processes, and above all, stability and a long-term approach. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Emma. It's really useful to have the moral and the practical issues that come up in this debate just set out so clearly like that. So thank you. And now I will hand over to Maha.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to all the other panelists really for interesting remarks. I am going to pivot a little bit to talk about sort of the broader picture of what Reeves is facing in this budget and some of the tools that she has talked about using and some of the tools that I think she could use, and try and contextualize those a bit in international context. I'm not going to say that much about wealth taxes and capital taxes in particular, in part because those have been so expertly handled from different perspectives by my co-panelists. But obviously, as people hopefully who are attending this are aware, Reeves is facing a fiscal gap of somewhere on the order of 20 to 30 billion that she needs to find some way to close, preferably in this budget. We have been hearing now, it feels like for quite some time. I almost can't believe this budget hasn't happened yet, because we've been hearing these trial balloons of different things that she might be considering, an extension of the income tax threshold freeze that's already in place, small increases in various kind of smaller taxes on gambling, on particular industries, and so on. And then the taxes that she's already raised, in her first budget on businesses, and sort of through increases in the employer national insurance contributions, but also, combined with other costs that have been imposed onto businesses through other labor policies since the government's come in. And then I'll come back to that in a moment. And then we did have trialed for a couple of weeks. In fact, if we were having this webinar a week ago, I think we would have been talking about what we thought was going to be an income tax rise, perhaps a change to the basic rate. Now we've been hearing since the weekend that is unlikely to take place. And so with that on the table, I want to say something about where the UK lines up against some of the sort of other OECD wealthy economies that it might be in a bucket with. As Helen was saying in her presentation, the UK's tax to GDP ratio is somewhere around the order, of 35% or so. And that is kind of within the mainstream of where OECD economies are, but it's not necessarily where you would expect the UK to be when you see which countries are clustered where. So countries like France, all of the Nordics are at well over 40%. Some of them well over 45%. Germany is a little higher than the UK at 38%. And then clustered around the UK are countries like Slovakia, Hungary, Eastern European countries. And the reason that's important is that the UK provides and tries to provide, and people expect it to provide, the government to provide, a range of public services that are comparable to the countries that are in that 40 to 45% tax to GDP ratio range. But its tax rates are actually closer to a group of countries who provide less comprehensive services to their citizens and have younger populations than the kind of Western European countries that are in the same bucket as the UK, dealing with aging population and rising demands on those public services that you just have. In an aging society, you have more healthcare needs, you have more social care needs, and so on. So despite sort of talk, of high taxes, the UK's overall tax burden is kind of moderate for a country with developed public services, and less of that tax is being raised from income and from basic income than would be the case in some of these other developed democracies. Now, what that means in practice is that the UK does have a more progressive income tax system than some of these other countries, in the sense that the ratio between the higher rate and the basic rate is very dramatic, right? We talk about this cliff edge when you go in to a higher kind of income bracket, right? So the ratio is very progressive. But actually, what's happening is that less income is being raised, right? Less taxes being raised from income, and a smaller percentage of the population, right, are actually contributing to the cost of public services. So in a Nordic democracy, sort of Scandinavian countries that have, right, very robust welfare and public services, it's not just that your sort of high income professionals, doctors, lawyers, investment bankers are paying high taxes, but teachers are paying taxes that are closer to the higher rate in the UK. Police officers are paying taxes that are closer to the higher rate in the UK. And so to some extent, the fundamental question I think that the UK faces, at some point, the rubber is going to meet the road around whether you can sustain, right, essentially Northwestern European levels of, right, expenditure on welfare and public services, which the public say they want, with tax rates, particularly basic income tax, broad-based taxation, that's actually quite a bit lower than most of the other countries that are in this particular situation. And so that's an argument, I think, for actually doing what Reeves was thinking about doing. Clearly what the government was trialing that they were prepared to do, which was to raise the basic rate. A 1% increase in the basic rate, 1p, could raise up to 7 billion, right, pounds in the next year. There isn't any combination of these little smorgasbord items that she's putting together that adds up to something like that. More importantly, it doesn't create some of the problems that we've been hearing about, that, you know, wealth taxes are difficult to design. We've been hearing all the ways that they're difficult to design and difficult to evade. Income tax tends not to have that same problem. But it also avoids raising more and more of these costs from businesses. And this Labour government has chosen to do a lot of its revenue raising from, right, things that ultimately are taxing employers. At the same time as what they're saying is they want economic growth, they need to have economic growth. Clearly, growth is abysmal, and you need growth in order for the pie to grow, for you to raise more tax from it. But if you keep imposing costs on businesses, that is money that businesses then don't invest in growing their business. And so there's some tension actually between those growth objectives and trying to get around just pressing, right, the big red income tax button. And that's particularly the case when you are also trying, as this government is trying to do, to constrain growth and immigration. Because, of course, one of the ways that some countries internationally have got around this dilemma is to say, we'll just be much more open to immigration, and that will be the way, right, that we generate some productivity, and therefore we generate some growth. And so there's a kind of trilemma here that I think the government is trying to avoid having to grasp. And at some point, that's going to become unavoidable. And to some extent, when it becomes unavoidable, is not in the government's control, because the model that we have, as we've been hearing in the other presentations, is very susceptible to kind of shocks in the global economy. Obviously, we're living in a very uncertain time. And so doing the thing that's actually in your control and that builds you some long-term stability is a way to not have to keep having this conversation in every budget of this parliament, and to do it early so you have some time for whatever you decide to spend that income on in services to bear some fruit, right, before the next election. And so those are the reasons that I think, although it sounds like they're not going to do it this time, that in the end, ultimately, they're going to have to do something about the basic rate to get out of the conundrum that they're in.
Thanks, Maha. Yeah, we'll have some time now for some questions on your presentation. So I'll just stay with you for the moment and just ask some more about the case for an income tax rise, although you've said that we don't expect that now. But you made a quite compelling case for it, and the revenues that it could bring in. Why do you think that they've apparently decided that the public won't swallow this, that this is not the time to do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, the obvious explanation is obviously that they'd made a pretty clear manifesto commitment not to do so. I think many economic experts think making that commitment was a mistake because they couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't need to do so. But I also think that there's a lack of grasping the nettle around the fact that if you do these small items and then they don't work and you have to come back next year, the longer you wait to do it, the more additional taxes have mounted by the time you press the income tax button. And then it's as though you're doing multiple tax rises rather than doing it now. But I think this is because they feel that they made this promise and that the electorate would come back and punish them. And I think that is possible. But I also think that if you're going to do it, you're better off doing it early, because if you do it early, you can spend it on investing in the NHS or investing in infrastructure or investing in the police or whatever public services it is. And in fact, they campaigned on fixing quite a range of them. Then you have time for that to bear fruit before the election. But I do think the reason it's not happening now is just because there is a sense that there would be some backlash, right, for breaking a promise.
Yeah, and as you say, though, the increased revenue that could come in now from making that move early might actually pay off in the rest of the Parliament. But yeah, it's that taboo of the manifesto pledge by the sounds of it. Thanks for that. I have a question now, going back to Emma's presentation. You were talking about the difficult political sell of a wealth tax. I was wondering if you could just talk a bit more about if you get beyond that difficult political sell, how would you avoid the loopholes and the special reliefs that you had mentioned, and what sort of specific ideas would you have for a government that did want to grasp that tax nettle and move in that direction?
Yeah, I think the way you avoid avoidance is basically to have it. It's much easier to avoid avoidance if you have a low threshold with low rates, which is the basic, and no reliefs or very few reliefs, because you're just drawing fewer lines in the sand, which people can navigate themselves around. And all the wealth taxes that failed, like Sweden, Germany, Austria, ultimately were held to be unconstitutional because basically they ended up applying to a very narrow group of people. But the problem is that having a widely based wealth tax is obviously much harder to get through because there are more people objecting to it in the first place. Switzerland's managed it really because they have it's based around the canton, and it's such a low rate and threshold that although wealthy people do pay quite a lot under it, it's quite hard to avoid. There's no real point in every year making a gift to your daughter and avoiding the wealth tax because you reduce your wealth, because it just means your daughter's going to pay the wealth tax instead. The broad consensus, though, I think among academics, is not to do that, is to have a very high threshold and just leave it to very wealthy people to pay. So you might have a threshold of 10 million, and above that, people over that threshold will pay a wealth tax. The difficulty with that is it's much easier to avoid. Firstly, those people are probably much more mobile. And secondly, they can just start mucking around with lifetime giving quite easily and avoiding paying wealth taxes. So you have to then start introducing a whole load of other stuff involved in that. So I think annual wealth taxes do genuinely present, unless they're at quite a low rate, issues of liquidity and valuation, which are never easy to solve. I mean, a one-off wealth tax, I think we thought maybe if you couldn't do it under COVID, it would be quite difficult to do it at any other time. I think that's probably where we are on that now. It doesn't mean we should give up reforming capital taxes, though. I think it did illustrate very usefully the difficulties and problems with our system. Yeah,
and I guess it comes back to some of those points that Maha was making about you package these things. If a one-off wealth tax couldn't be sold as a COVID recovery program, then perhaps just that that framing of it wasn't hitting home with voters.
Yeah, and I think people just didn't, they just thought they could borrow cheaply. And I do agree with Mike very much. You need a narrative. You need to explain to people why this is a good thing. And I think rather than just introducing a sort of thing of, oh, right, we're going to tax farms and businesses, but in a slightly different way from the way we tax everything else. I mean, it is quite dysfunctional. We've now got a system where long-term savings like pensions are now subject to inheritance tax, which in itself may not be wrong, but it does mean that people have done all sorts of things and planning based on some long-term things which now don't seem to be right. And it's a very complicated system that they've designed to impose inheritance tax, which will be deeply unpopular. And I think those sorts of ways of taxing capital probably aren't very helpful.
Well, let's come back to Mike now. Just on that, Mike, I was really struck by what you said about the wealth time bomb, and just wanted to give you an opportunity just to say a bit more about that and why you feel that's such a risk for us.
Yeah, I mean, so, and there's a great deal of sociological research and economic research on kind of, what would happen in the next 2 decades, and so some of the estimates from economists about trillions of pounds and dollars across the world being passed on to the next generation. So I think, and looking at contemporary UK from my perspective as a sociologist, and I'm interested in, and I know, this is, we look at the rise of populism, the rise of reform. There are many people who are really angry, aren't they? They feel left out. They don't feel they're being listened to. They feel, why is that the case? It's because they don't feel society is operating by common principles. And in a way, the transfer of wealth assets to the younger generation from the older generation is only going to make that more clear, I think, because how do you afford to buy a house? Well, you rely upon the bank of mum and dad. That will help ease out and make it more difficult for others without that resource to buy houses. Loads of research on people starting jobs in the cultural sector, where typically you don't become a famous novelist or actor immediately. You've got to have 10 years learning the tricks of the trade. So having wealthy parents who can bail you out during that period is crucial, and it's getting more difficult for working class actors and artists and so forth to get established. All these are really people are aware of this, and it's only going to get more manifest, I think, unless we recognize wealth does need to be tackled. And if I can just link into some of the things Emma was talking about, because Emma, I thought you downplayed the significance of your 2020 commission. You were saying you didn't know and believed it. I actually think you've got a lot of traction, and my own. So I think a lot of commentators, a lot of general public. If you look at many of the opinion polls, there's a lot of support for the principle of a wealth tax. Okay, discussions about wage or the threshold and how exactly you do it, but the general principle, I think, is out there. To me, what is kind of missing is kind of leadership from the top. People saying yes, we could do it. And my feeling is if we had a Labour Prime Minister who said that, which we clearly haven't, but if we did, I think a lot of people in the Labour Party and in civil society campaigning groups would go along with that, really. So I actually think you should pat yourself on the back. I think you actually did do a great deal to also address the administrative issues. How do you do it? What are the mechanisms and all that? And on this issue, I always find it a bit strange. People often say, well, if we have a wealth tax or whatever, people will find ways around it. The wealthy will, as they no doubt will, they'll talk to their accountants and they'll find ways of organising their affairs through trusts or whatever to try and avoid tax. But I think, we also know, for instance, there's an incredibly low rate of conviction for sex offences. We don't then say, let's decriminalise sex crime, do we? We just say we've got to do a better job at tackling that and think about how to improve enforcement of that. I think the same applies really around these issues. And in a way, bringing in some legislation around this, and then you can see to what extent are people avoiding it. You can begin to think about, are there mechanisms you can invoke? I'm always very struck, and again, thinking about historical parallels. When income tax was introduced in 1799, in the Napoleonic War, people said, you can't tax income. How on earth do you do that? Because they weren't used to doing it. And of course, at that point, people weren't paid for bank accounts and stuff. It was all, if you introduce a tax, you create a structure, and it may take some time, but you do create a structure by which you can measure it and you can begin to improve the efficiency of it. So there will undoubtedly be a process and a time period in which you develop the mechanisms, but I think, there's no reason to think it couldn't be done if there's a will to it. Okay.
Thanks, Mike. So on that, let's just come back to Helen and just put your point to her. Helen, you implied that the spoiler was that you might not necessarily be sold on the idea of a wealth tax. Is avoidance, is that one of the reasons for your thinking?
Yeah, I think it's one. So I absolutely agree with Mike about the narrative here. I think one of the difficulties is that when you get into the weeds of tax design, it's hard to do it in a nice, sort of 90 seconds thing that you can put on the BBC. So I think there's two issues with a wealth tax, and by which I mean like an annual. So backing up, the difference between a one-off wealth tax and an annual wealth, I think, is huge. So I think a one-off wealth tax, if you can do it and everyone credibly believes it's one-off, and that is difficult to pull off, but if you can do that, and as Emma said, you could type something that's happened in the world, then economically it's very efficient because people can't change their behaviour, and it's purely a question of fairness as to whether you want to do it. A one-off wealth tax is very different because it does change incentives. Now, I think there's a huge difference between, again, a one-off tax, an annual tax on stocks of wealth and the other set of taxes we've talked about capital gains and dividends and inheritance and so on. And I think, but taking about the annual tax, I think there are two types of problems. One is just a practical issue that Emma talked about. I think they really are serious practical limitations. And to relate to what Mike was saying about sort of historical comparisons, I think, if you look at the history of tax policy, in part, governments have taxed what they've been able to tax. And it used to be the case that it was easier to measure stocks of things than it was to measure flows of things. Even at that point in time, it was still hard to measure stocks of land or houses or whatever, but it was easier to do that than flows. It's now become much easier to measure flows. Income's an example of that. And then therefore we do that. Had it been as easy to measure income back in the day, I think we'd have had income taxes back in the day. So I think part of the history changes because things get easier and harder. So there is a practical issue with wealth tax. I think shouldn't be overlooked. If you have a wealth tax with big holes in it, as Emma described, you're going to have people changing their behaviours to take advantage of that. That is a problem because it means the tax is damaging some incentives, and there's a horizontal equity issue if you tax people differently depending on how they can arrange their affairs. But even if you imagine we could do the perfect wealth tax, and Emma worked out for us exactly how you could do that, and we could pull it off. Even then, I think there's a question about, is that in principle the best way to tax wealth? And I'm not convinced about that, actually. Again, there's lots of tax design things behind the scenes here, but imagine, and it's not to say I don't disagree with the problems that Mike has sort of laid out about wealth concentrations. It's about, do you want to tax stocks or flows? And I think I just rather tax. I think it's better to tax flows. Let me give you one example of that before I turn it into a tax lecture. Take two people who've both got the same amount of wealth. Let's say they've got £10 million. But one person's got a relatively low rate of return on that. They're just saving their £10 million for the future. And one's got a really high rate of return on that because they're running a business, they're putting lots of effort into it. A wealth tax taxes those two people the same. A capital gains tax or a capital income tax would be able to say, well, hang on, this guy, my second example, is getting these big rates of return because he's putting his labour income into this. Well, if he was an employee, I'd tax him. I want to tax him on these returns. And I want to tax him at a higher rate because he's getting higher returns. Capital gains tax is allowed to fine-tune like that in a way that wealth taxes don't. Final thing I'll say, though, however, there is a problem about the stock of wealth we've got now. In principle, if you could do a one-off wealth tax, you could solve that problem. But an annual tax taxes wealth again and again and again. The longer it's held, has these kind of other economic effects. That was a long-winded way of saying one-off and annual tax is very different. The devil really is in the detail about exactly what you're taxing and how you're designing it.
Thanks, Helen. We can move on to questions from the audience now and move away from the specifics of wealth tax for a second. I have a question for you, Helen, from Sarah Pemberton, who asks, let's say Reeves takes Helen's advice and decides to abolish stamp duty and fix council tax by using current property values and abolishing the single occupant reduction. How much would that raise?
Well, the simple answer in some ways is zero. So if you're doing but what I'm proposing is that you should, for a given amount of revenue, raise that revenue differently. So there's no good reason to have council tax be regressive. Doesn't necessarily need to be progressive, but regressive is odd. it shouldn't be based on 1991 values. Imagine doing that for income, it would be balmy. It's balmy for housing. So up-to-date values, make it proportional, and then however much money you want to raise from property in total, from council tax and stamp duty, raise it through council tax. So the reform I'm suggesting wouldn't raise you any money at all. It would just be a reformulation of the taxes. If you wanted to raise more money, then in some sense, it's how long's a piece of string. You could raise more money through council tax. Either you could raise it across the board and give everyone a higher council tax bill, or you could raise more at the top, and it's a choice. To give you one number to help you have a sense of scale, if the Chancellor chose to double rates of council tax in the top two bands in G and H, within the current broken system, no reform, that would raise you something like 4 billion. Also worth remembering that the public finance forecasts, I mean, council tax is already rising and due to rise over time. The forecasts already assume that it's going up by over 4% a year. So raising more would mean you'd need to have council tax bills go up by more than 4% a year to have that factoring into the for it to be good news for Rachel Reeves.
Yeah, and another questioner, Sarah Early, has touched on the same thing you've just mentioned there. She's asked why council tax should remain so regressive. Why not raise the bottom thresholds and then add more bands to the top, which you've touched on there? Do you want to say a bit more about what that might look like?
Yeah. So I think in some sense, ignoring what we've got currently, a straightforward thing to do would be to take all properties in the country and put today's values on them, and then to have a proportional tax. You could pick the rate off politically, but you just say, take your value times this number, that's your tax rate. Relative to what we have now, if you made it revenue neutral, that would mean lower taxes at the bottom and higher taxes at the top. But you could determine how progressive you wanted that, or proportional you wanted that schedule to be. One thing I'll mention in passing, because I can see Sarah's questions about national insurance. National insurance is actually progressive for most of the distribution, because there's a band, there's the personal allowance basically for which you don't pay any, and then there's rates. So it is true that the marginal rate drops off to 2%, and at the very, very tippy top it starts to be a sort of tip towards being regressive. But for most of the distribution, national insurance is actually progressive. But it is true that we have this oddity of these two taxes, income tax and national insurance, that are different in different ways and progressive to different degrees, and that adds, and actually the lack of transparency around that, I think in and of itself, independent of anything else, is a problem that we face in the UK.
I think one thing maybe to say about, raising the council tax bands is that, of course, it doesn't take account of debt. Someone sort of raised this in a question I see, because the wealth tax would. I think you can stop avoidance. I think there are more practical issues about an annual wealth tax, which we talked about on things like valuation and liquidity. But no one was suggesting that you value someone's gross wealth. If you value it net of liabilities, there would actually have to be certain anti-avoidance provisions to stop foreigners owning UK houses and charging them up with debt to avoid paying wealth tax on it. But those are all perfectly manageable issues, and we already have them to some extent. Whilst a council tax obviously is just an amount on the value of the house and wouldn't take account of debt, and that may be something one would have to consider a little bit, I think.
Yeah. There's also, there's a fun discussion here about whether you want to think of it as a wealth tax or actually a tax on consumption in some sense. So if you buy a fridge, you pay your VAT. If you're buying the consumption value of a house in some sense, you can think of a council tax actually stepping in place for a consumption tax. And in the consumption tax world, you wouldn't want to knock off the debt. But again, it comes back to what you're trying to do and how is council tax fitting into the broader mix of taxes you've got. But yeah.
I think it's difficult to say it's a wealth tax, really. I think it is more like a consumption tax.
It is, yeah.
Does anyone else on the panel want to come in on the council tax question?
I'll just quickly, Maha, you first.
Yeah, just to say, I agree. I don't think anybody really disagrees that the UK council tax system is just woefully it's fundamentally out of date, even if you don't change its design, right? The values that go into it, right? In my discipline, we sometimes say garbage in, garbage out, and the data that goes into that formula is just woefully out of date now, right? So that's a fundamental problem. But I also think that if you do it in a way where you do make it slightly more progressive, and I think this is also true about other forms of capital taxes, wealth taxes, and so on that are on the table. Obviously, as I said, I think none of these things will actually compensate for doing something about income if you want to keep the level of public spending that we have now. But if you do some of these other things and make them quite progressive, I think that can help with the political narrative that Mike's talking about. That one of the things that's hard about doing the income tax thing is that actually you will have to raise quite a lot more revenue from middle earners. People who don't feel that they're particularly wealthy, certainly the cost of living has squeezed them. And if you're asking those people to pay more, the ability to say that on some of these capital loaded things, we are doing something that's making the tax system more progressive, we're asking the very wealthy to chip in this way, even if it doesn't raise more revenue, even if there's avoidance, it helps you with the political narrative that you may need to then do the thing that you want to do on income.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I completely agree with what Helen and Emma and Maha were saying about reforming council tax. I think it's a big idea, but I also think we need to kind of broaden out a bit and recognise our housing market is not working well, is it? And I think that's partly goes back to the point you made, Maha, about raising income tax. We know many young people, struggle to get enough to get mortgages and things, and then any impact on their disposable income would make it even more difficult. And thinking about how we try and stop the focus, or a key focus of the owner-occupied housing market being about how to increase your asset value over time is important too. Clearly, the government have been, under Rachel Reeves, we're trying to expand house building as one way of dealing with that. But I think we need to recognise the issue of housing does have these extra additional concerns about the extremely high price of owner-occupied housing and the impact on renting too.
Can I just say one thing about that? I think it's a great point, and I think actually it's one thing where people including politicians, get very confused about the tax system in some sense. We have a humongous tax bias in favour of owner occupation. I think much higher than you could ever reasonably justify, and in a form that's very, very hard to justify, because there's a laundry list of ways in which the tax system skews towards owner occupation. And at the same time, you often hear no one's got any love for landlords, let's tax the landlords higher, without thinking about the fact, well, that makes this bias worse, and that landlords rent houses to people that we do care about with renters. So the housing market is a complex system, and often people pick off little bits of it, or let's just tax the landlords high, without thinking about the broader ramifications or how all these tax things slot together. So I think it's a great example where we absolutely need reform of a whole range of taxes that affect the allocation of houses we have across different kinds of people.
Well, on that subject, Helen, of taxation more widely, Judy Patterson has asked, why does the UK have such a complex set of tax rules which appear to encourage tax evasion? Would it not be better to have a transparent set of rules on main taxes and do away with all of the complexity to minimise tax evasion?
And yes, you're not going to find anybody saying let's have more complexity. I mean, look, I think one thing worth saying is, simplicity is great where you can have it. We obviously care about other things other than simplicity. I mean, to make a glib point, if all we cared about was simplicity, we'd do a poll tax, nice and simple, easy, but we'd be lynched, probably lynched. So obviously there is some complexity that you want to have in a system because it allows you to fulfill other objectives. So to fulfill your redistributive objectives, or to try to minimize damage on incentives, for example. So we shouldn't expect a tax system that has no complexity. The point that I would make, and I'm sure Emma would make as well, is that we have more complexity than you need to fulfill those political objectives, and that actually people like me and Emma, design taxes and say, look, for a given set of political goals, here's how you could raise that money from these people with less cost. So why we have it is, a good question. I think partly we have it because we have a tendency in this country, and we're not alone in this, sadly, other governments do this, of always layering something on top. We don't want to say, step back and let's redesign something and start from scratch. We often say, let's just tweak this or tweak that or add this in. And often the complexity comes about by somebody had a bright idea at some point to have an incentive somewhere because they wanted to encourage something, and they shoved it in. And then they shoved another one in, and then another one in. And before you know it, you've got people like me and Emma pulling our hair out saying, what is this? So I think it's partly some complexity you should expect, but it's partly a sort of political processing about how these kind of barnacles get added to the tax system. And once you've got something, it's very hard to take it away. Let me give you one example, but I could give you 500. We have the so-called removal of the personal allowance that kicks in at £100,000. Now, whether you like that or not, it's a very not a transparent way to describe. We basically have a marginal tax rate that has a hump in it. And you could describe it like that, but we don't. We describe it as the removal of the personal allowance. But now that's in place, it's really hard to remove, because if you removed it, it would look like a big giveaway to rich people. So it was put in place as a kind of a political wheeze to raise some more money. But now you have this odd kink. It's just very hard to get rid of. And again, that's just one of hundreds of examples we can go through where you have this layering effect in the taxes.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not just the question was about tax evasion, but it's not really tax evasion, it's tax avoidance. And I think I sent Helen something on Sunday night about something she mentioned, and it was 3 pages of complexity about an interest relief restriction, which she didn't agree with anyway. You know, it's crazy, our system, and it is actually noticeably more complicated than other jurisdictions. The US, India, Europe, they do not have as complicated a system. And that's partly, I'm afraid to say, because politicians just don't face up to reality. They not only do they want to have incentives, they don't actually want to tackle the losers. And you do sometimes have to say, look, this relief doesn't make any sense. I mean, we had a roadmap for corporate tax. I think George Osborne was trying to reduce corporate tax rates. In one fell swoop, that got completely reversed by Rishi Sunak, who then introduced 3 types of relief for research and development. What happens 2 years later? We get the revenue setting up an anti-avoidance unit to deal with all these research claims that are totally bogus. There's an absolute classic example of how the whole system is dysfunctional. Someone's asked about charity release in the question about how much does it cost and why should we should we have relief from inheritance tax on gifts to charities? I made the mistake once of saying we shouldn't have any reliefs, including charitable exemption, and we should just have 10 or 20% inheritance tax. That was it. I had all the charities on my back saying this is a terrible idea. So now we've got high inheritance tax rates because charities don't want them to be less, because then people would give less to charity. I mean, the whole thing's ridiculous. We have to sort of get away from this, and that does take political courage. And it is a lot easier to reform things when you're reducing rates. I don't think it's that easy to have political reform at the moment, because we're needing to raise money, and that makes it quite a lot harder, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I have a question from Jackie Smith on income tax rises. I'll put this one to Maha. Jackie's asking, wouldn't it make more sense to equalise or even merge capital gains tax rates rather than increasing income tax per se? And that was touched on in at least one of the presentations, the discrepancy between tax on assets and on income. Jackie goes on to say that would also encourage companies to invest in productivity rather than paying more to shareholders. Maha, I'll come to you on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So it's a great question, and it's one that often comes up in, these conversations. I think there's an argument on the merits for doing it, in the sense that while there's a big discrepancy between the way that capital income is taxed and the way that sort of ordinary income is taxed, you are incentivizing, and again, we've been talking about complexity and the way that complexity creates incentives to do things that maybe don't make a huge amount of sense, that they create an incentive for businesses to remunerate people who are essentially employees, not primarily through salary and through other things that then are getting taxed on a lower capital gains. And that's not necessarily something that we want them to be doing. But there are ways to kind of ring fence that kind of income and say, okay, that's not really capital income. That's just you taking your salary and stocks and shares, and we're going to treat it as ordinary income without necessarily doing that equalization across everything. There may be other reasons that we want, capital gains to be taxed at a lower rate. But for the purposes of this budget, right, even if you equalize it, you will not close, right? You'll raise some money. You will not raise the kind of money that we're talking about that is necessary to close the fiscal gap that she has. And I think it's kind of indicative, and this goes to the discussion that was taking place about the last question, of the sort of inability to face up to the kind of political conundrum, which is that whatever we do, whether it's income or wealth or something else, it is going to need to be broad-based. It is going to need to be a tax rise that is borne by the majority of taxpayers in this society. And if people are not actually willing to do that, then there will be some loss of service somewhere. And I think the reason we have the system we have is that there hasn't been for a decade a government of any persuasion that has been willing to say that, clearly to the public.
Can I jump in? Sorry. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to jump in quickly on that. So this is actually a question that I've spent many, many years working on directly. And I think it's one where there are basically two problems with how we tax capital gains and capital incomes more broadly. And I think one is the one that the people in the questions are raising that we just talked about, that rates are lower on capital gains and capital incomes. That creates a whole range of problems, including people shifting into capital incomes, and it's unfair. But, and this is the really important bit, but the design of those taxes is such that if you just increase rates, you discourage investment and saving. And part of the problem, again, without taking to the tax lecture, part of the problem is, for example, the easy way to say, we tax inflationary gains. So if I put money in a bank and I get some inflationary gains, then you tax me on that. That's discouraging savings. But importantly, we know how to design a capital gains tax and a capital income taxes to remove those disincentives. And to Emma's point earlier, this is where I absolutely agree with the big picture point that it's much harder to reform when you're raising rates. But take capital gains tax. If the government just increased the rates of that, they'd raise tiny sums. In fact, the Ready Reckoner from HMRC says they'd start losing money quite quickly. If you reformed the tax base so that you weren't discouraging investment and saving, and so that there wasn't so much opportunity to shift across time, for example, then you could not only raise more at lower economic cost, you could just raise more revenue in total. So that's one where actually reform, a broader package of reform, might open up some scope to do more. Now, that's still going to be tricky, but again, I think thinking more holistic was what I meant earlier about the devil's in the detail. I think there's a night and day difference between just raising current capital gains rates or implementing the kind of capital gains tax that I would propose as a better design capital gains tax, and then increasing that.
Thanks, Helen. An interesting question for everyone on the panel here from Matthew Shepherd, who's asking what the panel thinks about ways to mitigate the cost of public services through more direct (brackets consumption) taxes. For example, people paying to visit a GP with fees linked to HMRC returns. He gives the example of a 40% taxpayer pays £40, a 20% taxpayer pays £20, and someone on income support pays nothing. Matthew makes the case that this kind of system seems to work in other countries like Australia. And then he finishes by saying, the political impact aside, could this work in the UK to put a dent in government debts? Helen, we'll stick with you if you want to answer first.
Sure. I mean, look, there are lots of things you can do about public spending. I mean, you can basically do less and more of it. You can means test it in some way. And we have lots of our system that is means tested. Like benefits are a good example of that. But things like prescription charge, we already have prescription charges. Actually, we have a prescription charge for drugs, but most people don't pay that because it's pregnant women and children and old people don't pay. But we have some kind of means testing. I mean, yes, we could start having user fees. And if you're going to have a user fee, you could design them all sorts of different ways. You could link them to people's tax payments or their income or their wealth or something else, their immigration status. We do that already. We link people's payments to immigration status. So yes, we could do it. And in terms of how much it would raise, again, it's how big is a piece of string. I mean, you could raise it in very small ways, like the prescription charge is actually a relatively small pot of money, or you could do fees to see a GP or something that are actually quite substantial. One thing I'd mention, if we are thinking about healthcare in particular, so two things. If you're thinking about some services, it wouldn't work. So you can't fund prisons, for example, on a pay-as-you-go system. For healthcare in particular, one thing to watch out for is if you make it harder or more expensive people to get preventative care, they might be more likely to end up in emergency care, which could be more expensive. So you have to think again about not only the kind of who do you want to pay, but the incentives it creates about when to take out care. But the big picture question, I think this is exactly the question that society needs to be grappling with. As we have an aging population or more pressures on the state, what do you want the state to do? What do you want to fund through general taxation? And where do you want there to be a co-pay of some sort or a means test of some sort? And that's going to be that's across the system. You can have that debate for any given service.
Can I come in here, Sarah?
Yes, I was just about to say you look like you wanted to say something.
So, I mean, I think, so thanks, Matt, for the question, right? I think the question is an example of grasping the nettle, right? But I think it's, maybe slightly misleading to talk about a model like this as really mitigating the cost through taxes. What you're actually doing if you do something like that is you're changing the nature of what the health service provides, right? And that people in the UK currently, the public assumes that the service they have is a service that is free at the point of use, right? That's the phrase that we use. Now, if you say actually on the current level of taxation and the level of taxation that we are willing or able politically to sustain, free at the point of use for everybody is not possible, and therefore we're going to do this or we're going to do something else, you've actually changed the nature of the service. You will then also change the way people use the service. You may end up providing, as Helen says, less preventative care, more other care, and costs go up. Obviously, in societies where healthcare is fully privatized, like the United States, you have that problem. People don't seek preventative care because it is very expensive to go and see a GP, and then they end up right in the emergency room, and that cost actually ends up being much higher because things are much more serious at the time that people go. Now, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't work at a narrow economic level, in the sense that, yes, if you do that, you will lower some of the cost to the taxpayer because you're raising more revenue from the user, but it is in effect a sort of stealthy kind of service cut. And it may be that that is the direction, right, that the public wants to go. And it may be that the direction the public wants to go is to say, we want to keep the system that we have and we're willing to pay more money for it. But I think the choice has to be actually explicitly framed in those terms. And I think part of the problem, the conundrum that we're facing, is that we have a government that made two competing promises to the electorate, right? That they would keep the services they have and even restore them after a period of service cuts under the previous government, and also that they wouldn't raise these taxes. And it may not be possible to do both of those things.
Can I come in?
Yeah, of course, Mike.
Yeah. No, I mean, these are really important questions. There obviously has been a slight movement towards this direction. I mean, I don't know, 17, 18 years ago when child benefit was means tested, and then winter fuel allowances means tested under the current government. My worry, and I can see the reasons of this. And why should wealthy people, get these things free of charge, or get the benefits in the same way as people who are less well off? But the worrying thing from my perspective is one of the cultural powers of the welfare state is that everyone benefits from it. And there is a sense that we're all in the same system together, we're all in the same boat, regardless of whether we're really well off or not well off. The more you strip back these things, and then my worry is the kind of wealthy people will be saying, I'm basically have a form of private insurance. It may be private insurance to use it, because I have to pay to go see the GP, but I'm still paying for it. So the wealthy people will kind of mentally opt out of thinking about themselves as being part of this universal system, and over time it'll lead to this kind of more divided set of understandings about welfare itself. So I completely do agree it's a choice we have as a society, but I would just want to keep in the mix the idea of some universalizing goods, as we still have, for instance, state pensions, which are not means tested and all that. It should still be in the mix.
Yeah. Emma, did you want to come in on that question?
No, I mean, I agree with Mike. There is something attractive about everybody being in the same boat together, and we all get these benefits without necessarily having them all means tested. And I suppose the other thing is that means testing is quite administratively complicated. I mean, the winter fuel allowance is now restricted, but the way they've done it is going to probably cost some money, I would think. It is very, very administratively complicated, and will no doubt, like the child benefit restriction, lead to lots of litigation and arguments in tribunals, all of which isn't very helpful and is not very productive.
Yeah. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to turn back to Mike initially on one last question. The question is from Rob Wills, who's asking about billionaires and how their wealth has increased over the past 15 years. And Rob is saying that the cause is successive governments that have allowed this to happen. But his question is, how do we reverse it? And I guess I'd want to ask, Mike, can we reverse it?
Yeah. We all know the figures, don't we? But Elon Musk could become a trillionaire, whatever it is. So I think so just on the comparative point, I think can we reverse it? It's clearly not going to be easy. I think the UK is a very interesting case, though, isn't it? Because we are an extremely transnational economy. We have the whole culture of using trust, and I do this work with sociologists where we try to map out who has economic power in the UK, and we have a project looking at elites across different countries. We have a far higher proportion of wealthy people and people in elite positions who are not born in the UK. We have a lot of. So I actually think the UK is a big player in the kind of international economy, not just because of our size of our GDP, whatever we are, sixth in the world, but also because of the strategic role of, the British are very good at inventing exemptions. The idea of the trust came from us, didn't it? So actually, I think the UK making a bit of a mark and say, we think it's really important to tackle some of these issues. And I mean, and as I understand it, David Cameron did this 10, 12 years ago about thinking about trying to be clear about transparency issues, might actually have some spillover effect across the world. To be sure, some of these elites are so transnational, they will find a way of hiding their money one way or another. But I still think just trying to make more of a point that this is not behavior which is condoned, might make some kind of difference.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Emma, I'm sure you have something to say on this as well.
I'm much more pragmatic. I don't really, if billionaires want to come and stay here, that's fine by me. I think we just want to make sure that we have a tax system that people can see everyone is contributing, and it's really how much you contribute that's the issue here. I don't think we should be saying we don't want billionaires here, or that we should tax people so they aren't billionaires anymore. I think also there's a danger in lumping everyone who's wealthy together. They're very diverse groups. So you might have a very young person who's a fintech or IT guy who all he does is work all day. Actually, money isn't so important to him, it's just work. And where he works, whether he works in Gibraltar or Dubai or the UK, doesn't really make much difference to him. And if we tax those people too much, in the end, they probably won't stay here. And I think that there is, someone asked about a brain drain. I think there is some sort of brain drain going on among certain types of people, not everyone by any means, but that worries me. So I don't like the narrative of saying, oh, we don't want millionaires and billionaires here and we should tax them as much as possible. But I think there's a better narrative to say we should all contribute, and it's how we contribute and minimize avoidance that is a better route. But you'll have older people who whatever the tax system, won't leave, and I think they're much more diverse than I think people want to imagine, and they have very different sets of behaviours and motivations.
Thanks, Emma. That's a really interesting note that I think we should probably finish on. But I would just like to say it's been such a pleasure to have the opportunity to listen into this discussion. And it's clear from everything we've heard that there won't be any easy decisions for the Chancellor next week. But from the insights that you've all given us on the panel, it's also clear that some taxes might be more damaging than others, not only in terms of the UK's economic growth, but also the effect on real people and how they live their lives. So I'd just like to thank you just for illustrating all these really interesting points that we've touched on this evening. We're really grateful to all the panelists that you could find the time in your busy schedules to be with us tonight. I think it's really been worthwhile and so interesting. And I'd just like to finish by thanking all of the audience who've joined us as well. And I hope that you found the discussion as useful and as interesting as we have too. So thank you very much, everyone, and good evening.